The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song at 6:47 in the morning. Sarah Chen stood at the nurse's station of Mercy General Hospital in Houston, her trembling hands gripping a patient chart with white knuckles. Not from fear. From the weight of everything she wasn't allowed to be anymore. She'd been here 4 days. For days of perfectly folded scrubs, perfectly measured words, perfectly invisible presence. The tremor in her fingers had started on day 2, a phantom twitch that visited her when she held things too long, when she gripped too tight, when she remembered that her hands once held a man's intestines together while helicopters screamed overhead and the ground beneath her boots was the color of rust. Her left shoulder burned where the fall line went in yesterday for the required hospital physical. The shrapnel scars had made the nurse uncomfortable. Sarah had watched the woman's eyes flick across the constellation of puncture wounds running from collarbone to armpit, tracked the moment of recognition that passed through her face, not recognition of Sarah, but recognition of the kind of injury that required stories Sarah would never tell. She turned a page in the chart. Her penmanship was perfect. Capital letters evenly spaced. Each number precisely formed. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who'd been trained to document evidence under fire, to keep records that might save lives in interrogation rooms or operating theaters. Her handwriting announced precision. It announced discipline. It announced nothing about who she actually was. The supply room was 3 hallways north. Sarah pushed through the double doors at 6:53 a.m., when the hospital was still mostly sleeping, just the night shift winding down and the day shift arriving in tired clusters. The supply room smelled like plastic and sterile packaging, like the cardboard boxes that arrived daily from vendors, like the industrial antiseptic they sprayed on everything. She began her inventory. Standard procedure. Check the equipment orders against the actual deliveries. Match serial numbers. Flag discrepancies. She'd learned this task in her first week, and she performed it with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to dismantling an AK-47 in absolute darkness. The equipment order from 3 weeks prior caught her eye. Advanced Cardiac Monitoring System. The invoice read $47,000. She pulled up the actual unit specifications from the hospital system. The same equipment, identical model number, was listed at $31,500 on the manufacturer's direct price list. She cross-referenced the vendor name. A company called Meridian Surgical Solutions. She'd never heard of it before. She pulled the previous 5 months of invoices. Every single one inflated. Not by accident. By design. 15% higher than market rate. Sometimes 20. Sometimes more. Her hands stopped trembling. She pulled her phone from her pocket and photographed each invoice. Her movements were deliberate now, mechanical, the way she moved when she was processing information that mattered. The way her body had learned to move when lives hung in the balance. The door to the supply room opened. She didn't look up. Morning inventory. Dr. Harrison from Pediatrics was reaching for gauze packs. Yes, Dr. Harrison. Everything stocked. He nodded and left without looking at her. Just another nurse. Just another girl doing her job in the fluorescent silence. Sarah placed the invoices back in the filing cabinet in their exact order. She noted the pattern. She committed the numbers to memory. 47,000, 31,500. The $15,000 difference per unit. Multiply by 12 months. Add the others. The numbers stacked themselves in her mind the way they always had, precise, inevitable, damning. She was moving down the corridor toward room 347 when the smell hit her. Not antiseptic this time. Gunpowder and dust and something else. Something that smelled like Tikrit in July, like blood drying on hot concrete, like the kind of heat that comes out of the ground itself and tries to cook you from the feet up. She stopped walking. Breathed. The smell dissolved. Just her mind. Just a ghost of a memory her body hadn't finished burying. Room 347 was at the end of the east corridor. Michael Torres lay in the hospital bed with his left arm exposed, the tattoo visible even from the doorway. Her name? Chen. Block letters in militarist-style ink. She knew exactly when he'd gotten it. She knew exactly why. She'd carried him 3 miles through the Jolan district in Tikrit on a June afternoon when the temperature exceeded 118 degrees. His right femur was shattered. His blood was pouring out faster than fluids could replace it. The extraction team was 12 minutes out. She had run with him across open ground while rounds snapped past her head like angry wasps, and she had not put him down. She had carried him over her left shoulder, the shoulder where shrapnel would enter her body 4 hours later, and she had promised him he would make it home. He had made it home. She had not. She entered the room with her chart and her careful smile. "Good morning, Mr. Torres. How's your pain level this morning?" He looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger. Polite. Distant. The traumatic brain injury had stolen everything except basic functioning. The part of his brain that remembered her face was gone. The part that might have recognized her name was irretrievable. "Pain's okay," he said. "You new here. Started last week. I'm Sarah." Sarah. He nodded like he was filing the information away, though they both knew it wouldn't stick. "Nice to meet you, Sarah." She adjusted his full line. She checked his vitals. She documented his status in perfect, precise handwriting. She did not cry. She did not remember the moment he'd grabbed her hand in that helicopter and asked her for her name so he could tattoo it on his arm before he forgot her face. She did not think about the fact that he had kept that promise to himself, kept her name inked onto his skin, even though the memory attached to it had evaporated completely. She finished her notes. She smiled. She left the room. The locker room was empty at 7:14 a.m. Sarah opened her locker and looked at the pair of worn combat boots at the bottom, hidden beneath her spare scrubs. They were desert tan color, the leather scuffed from 12 years of operations across 3 continents. They had walked through Mosul. They had stood in a phi base in the Hindu Kush. They had carried her through Tikrit. They had mud from a patrol base in Kandahar still visible in the grooves of the sole, dried mud from a war that officially never happened, from a unit that had been struck from every database, from a woman named Sarah Chen who had ceased to exist the moment she walked out of the Pentagon and into a civilian hospital in Houston. She closed the locker. The metal made a soft clicking sound as the lock engaged. Down the hallway, in an office with a window that faced the nurse's station, Dr. Marcus Sterling sat behind a mahogany desk that had cost $18,000 and was designed to communicate authority. He was reviewing the morning's surgical schedule. He was drinking coffee that had been delivered to him by a junior resident. He was comfortable in the way that men who have never experienced meaningful resistance become comfortable. He had been the head of surgery at Mercy General for 14 years. He had built a reputation as a brilliant operator. His board certifications were legitimate. His published research was thorough. What was not published was the network of relationships he had cultivated beneath the surface, vendor connections that funneled surgical equipment through his preferred companies at inflated costs, kickback arrangements that had, over the past 7 years, accumulated into approximately $2.3 million in offshore accounts he believed were perfectly hidden. The morning supply inventory report appeared in his inbox at 7:31 a.m. He opened it absently, the way he opened dozens of administrative documents each day. He was looking for nothing in particular. He found something instead. The inventory numbers matched the invoices. That was the problem. They matched perfectly. Because perfect accuracy was impossible. There should have been discrepancies. Missing units. Clerical errors. The kinds of natural gaps that made it impossible to prove intentional patterns. The numbers were too perfect. He scrolled down. Every entry. Every unit. Every cost cross-referenced and verified. Not with suspicion. With meticulous care. The kind of inventory report a person would file if they were trying to create a record. A documentation. He pulled up the supply room access logs. Who had been in there yesterday morning? Who had photographed the invoices? The security camera footage showed a woman in a blue scrub top moving methodically through the filing cabinets. She was in there for 6 minutes and 43 seconds. Not long enough to steal anything. Long enough to document everything. He recognized her from the staff photos. A new hire. Nurse trainee, it said. Sarah Chen. Started last Monday. Night shift and early morning rotations. Exactly the kinds of shifts that would put her in the supply room when no one was watching. Exactly the kind of schedule that would allow her to move through the hospital unnoticed. He opened her personnel file. Education history. License verification. Previous employer references listed a hospital in San Diego. He would call them. He would find out if she was the problem or if she was just competent enough to recognize a problem that had already existed before she arrived. He pulled out his cell phone. It was 7:42 a.m. He scrolled through his contacts. His brother-in-law was the chief hospital administrator. His former roommate was the chair of the board of directors. His golf partner was the head of HR. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that came from understanding exactly how much power flows beneath surfaces. How many phones could ring at once? How many conversations could happen before a word was ever spoken? He dialed the first number. The fluorescent lights hummed. Sarah Chen was moving through the east corridor toward the medication dispensary. She had no idea that she had just become visible to a man who had spent 14 years remaining invisible. She had no idea that a phone call was being made on the other side of the hospital that would, within 24 hours, become an entire campaign. She had no idea that Dr. Sterling was about to learn something that would terrify him more than any threat, that she could not be intimidated or threatened or shamed into silence, because she had already been trained by an institution far more powerful than his medical empire to endure things that would break ordinary people. But that wasn't the worst part. The supply room smelled of antiseptic and cardboard, rows of surgical equipment stacked on metal shelves, inventory sheets clipped to every bin. Sarah was cross-referencing the cardiac monitor specifications when Dr. Sterling pushed through the door, his white coat crisp, his bearing absolute. She had the numbers spread on a clipboard, the unit cost for the last 3 equipment orders, each one flagged with a discrepancy that made no medical sense. $15,000 per unit. Every single one. Dr. Sterling, I wanted to ask about the last cardiac. You've been here what, 3 weeks? His voice cut through her sentence like a scalpel. And you think you know better than a surgeon with 20 years' experience? He didn't wait for an answer. He simply took the clipboard from her hands, glanced at it with visible contempt, and handed it back. Inventory isn't your department, Ms. Chen. Stick to what you were hired to do. He turned and left, the door hissing shut behind him. That was all it took. One erasure. One dismissal. The unspoken message, you don't belong here. You never will. But it was what happened 7 hours later that would reshape everything. The hospital cafeteria at noon was a controlled storm of scrubs and conversations, residents hunched over laptops, nurses refueling between 12-hour shifts, attending physicians clustered in their own social ecosystem. Sarah carried her tray to an empty table in the corner, the kind of seat that told the room she knew her place in the hierarchy. Pasta marinara, a salad, black coffee. She had taken exactly 3 bites when Sterling's voice rose above the ambient noise, loud enough to carry across the entire cafeteria. I'll tell you what. He stood at a table of residents, medical students hanging on his every word because he was the type of surgeon who made or broke careers with a single recommendation. I'll bet a month's salary, that's $4,000, the new girl quits within a week. Look at her. He pointed. Every head turned. Sarah felt 30 pairs of eyes settle on her like a physical weight. See? That look. Too soft for real medicine. She doesn't have the constitution. By Friday, she'll be crying in the parking lot, wondering why she ever thought she could cut it in a place like Mercy General. Laughter rippled through the residents. One of them, a third-year named Mitchell, shook his head. You're brutal, Sterling. I'm honest. He grinned, the kind of grin that revealed nothing but satisfaction. Watch. Weak tops. Sarah's fork froze halfway to her mouth. She could feel the heat of the attention, the collective assumption settling over her like a shroud. She was invisible, and then she was the target. There was no middle ground. Around her, conversations resumed, but there was an undercurrent now, a current of anticipation. This was entertainment. This was how hierarchies were reinforced. Sterling turned, his eye scanning the cafeteria with the precision of a predator assessing prey. His gaze found her. He smiled. Then, with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced consequences, he walked toward her table. Sarah looked down at her pasta. She knew what was coming. Some instinct bred into her bones by years of classified operations, by moments where reading the room meant the difference between breathing and not breathing, told her exactly what the next seconds would contain. Sterling's hand rose, not in violence, not in anger, but in something almost worse. In contempt. His arm swept across her lunch tray with the force of a man swatting an insect. The plate flipped. Pasta and marinara sauce exploded across her lap, splattering the white tiles beneath the table in a Jackson Pollock of red. The clatter of ceramic hitting floor echoed through the cafeteria like a gunshot. Forks paused. Conversations died. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice pitched to Carrie. He tossed a patient chart, thick, full of data, important, at her feet, letting it land in the sauce. "And while you're down there, learn your place." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that made you aware of every sound around it, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant beep of monitors from the ICU, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing their electric drone. No one moved. No one breathed. Sarah took one measured breath. The kind of breath she had learned to take in places where panic was a death sentence. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. And then, from her left eye, a single tear escaped, not a tremor, not a breakdown, but one solitary line of moisture that traced down her cheek like an accusation. She knelt slowly, her scrubs absorbing marinara sauce, and began gathering the scattered pages of the chart. The pasta. The pieces of ceramic. Each movement deliberate. Each movement controlled. The room watched. Sterling watched. Mitchell watched. Everyone waited to see if this was the beginning of the end, if she would crumble under the weight of public humiliation. Sarah rose to her full height. She wiped the tear away with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact with Sterling. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, quieter than his, which meant everyone had to stop what they were doing to hear her. "I've cleaned up worse messes from better men." She turned and walked away. Her lunch abandoned. Her dignity intact. The room exhaled. Sterling's jaw tightened for just a moment, a muscle working beneath his skin, before he laughed, loud and sharp. "See? Weak tops. 2 days, maybe." He turned back to his residence, but something had shifted in his expression. His pupils were dilated. His breathing was elevated. He had tried to break her. He had tried to shame her in front of an audience. And she had responded in a way that made the audience question who was actually standing in judgment. Over the next 3 days, Sterling escalated. He called her new girl exclusively, never using her name, a linguistic erasure designed to reinforce her status as temporary, as lesser. He reassigned her best patients, the ones recovering well, requiring minimal intervention. Instead, he scheduled her for the worst shifts, nights with 3 critical patients, understaffed recovery rooms, the kind of impossible math that broke nurses. In morning rounds, he questioned every decision she made with surgical precision. "Did they not teach basic wound care wherever you worked before?" "Oh wait," he paused, consulting a chart with exaggerated confusion. "Where did you work before, Ms. Chen?" "I keep forgetting." Sarah answered with hospital name and dates. He nodded, writing something down, his expression suggesting he would verify it later. She knew he would. She knew what he would find. Each insult, each dismissal, each calculated moment of professional disrespect was absorbed by Sarah with a kind of quiet dignity that came from having endured far worse. She responded only when necessary, each word chosen with surgical precision. "Yes, doctor. I'll adjust the protocol immediately, doctor." Never defensive. Never emotional. Never broken. By day 4, Sterling was making phone calls from his office. The door was closed, but his voice carried through the gap at the bottom, urgent and proprietary. "I need you to watch someone for me. She's hiding something. I can feel it. Those references? None of them check out. The numbers don't add up. I need to know who she really is before she figures out how to hurt this hospital." He was building his case. Not with evidence, not yet, but with the kind of subtle insinuation that planted seeds in the minds of powerful people. Board members who trusted his judgment. Hospital investigators who owed him favors. An institutional momentum that, once started, was almost impossible to stop. Sarah was 2 tables away from the break room door at 2:15 p.m. on day 7 when she heard the first crash. It came from the surgical wing, not the usual controlled chaos of a code, but something violent. Something wrong. She stood immediately. Around her, other nurses looked up. Someone in the corridor shouted. Then the double doors to the surgical wing burst open with enough force to crack against the walls, and a man emerged who seemed to fill the hallway with sheer physical presence, 6'5", maybe 250, with wild eyes and a grip on a pipe wrench that suggested he knew how to use it. "Where are the doctors who killed my brother?" His voice was grief wrapped in rage, the sound of someone who had already died and was still learning how to scream. "Cardiac surgeon. Where is he?" Code Silver alarm. The emergency announcement blared through the hospital's internal speaker system. Instantly, every trained response kicked in. Nurses scattered into patient rooms, pulling curtains. A resident sprinted past toward the stairwell. An orderly dove behind a supply cart. Security was 2 floors away. Sarah could calculate response time in her head. Maybe 90 seconds if they were moving fast. The man advanced down the corridor, his wrench rising and falling, smashing a cardiac monitor in an explosion of sparks and plastic. The glass observation window into operating room 3 rattled. Through it, Sarah could see Sterling performing a valve replacement, patient still open, still under anesthesia. She watched his face transform from surgical focus to pure animal fear. He dropped his instruments, the sound was distinct even from a distance, metal clattering against the surgical tray, and abandoned the patient. A third-year resident, someone maybe 5 years into medicine, was left staring at an open chest cavity and an unfinished procedure. The man bellowed again. "Cardiac surgeon. Where is he?" Sarah stood 30 feet away in the recovery area. Every staff member in visible distance had fled. The attacker's eye swept the corridor and found her. She raised her hand slowly, palms visible, non-threatening, the kind of gesture that said, "I am not a threat, but more importantly, I am not running." She began walking toward him. Every instinct in the room screamed against it. The absence of flight activated a different kind of attention. The man with the wrench paused, confusion rippling across his grief-ravaged face. He was looking for targets to hurt, exits to block, reasons to swing. He was not expecting someone to walk toward him with their hands raised and their voice steady. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I'm a nurse. Tell me your brother's name." The wrench wavered. Just slightly. "David. David Morrison." His voice cracked like concrete under stress. "They said the surgery went fine. They said he was stable. And then he just died." Sarah kept walking. 5 feet away now. Close enough that she could see the whites of his eyes, the tremor in his hands, not weakness, but the catastrophic shaking that comes from grief converting to violence and back again. Her voice remained steady, the same tone that had once talked down an armed insurgent outside a schoolhouse in Tikrit. "David Morrison. I am so sorry." She took another step. "Tell me what happened." Tell me about David. The man's face crumpled. The wrench began to lower. Sarah was 4 feet away, 3 feet, close enough that if he swung she could not escape, and that was the point. The point was to be here. The point was to hear him. An alarm suddenly shrieked from operating room 3, not a code, not a status update, but the distinct sound of a flatline monitor. The patient on the table had lost cardiac rhythm. The third-year resident was alone with an open chest, an abandoned surgery, and a patient who was dying. The surgical wing operated in controlled chaos on day 7 of Sarah Chen's employment at Mercy General. OR3 hummed with precision, Dr. Sterling, his hands moving with the arrogant fluidity of a man who had never questioned his own supremacy, was halfway through a mitral valve replacement when the monitors above his patient's open chest began their steady electronic song. Sarah stood in the observation gallery, charting vitals, watching Sterling work with the detached focus of someone who'd learned long ago that competence and cruelty often wore the same face. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm beneath his murmured instructions. Around her, the OR staff moved like satellites orbiting an undisputed star. Below, in the patient, a 67-year-old retired oilman named David Reeves, everything was proceeding exactly as textbooks promised it would. Then the surgical wing doors exploded inward. The man who crashed through them was massive, wild-eyed, his face a contorted mask of grief and rage. He was screaming, his voice cutting through the hospital's ambient white noise like a siren that had learned to speak. A pipe wrench hung from his right fist, heavy enough to cave skulls, and he was swinging it in wide arcs as he moved deeper into the corridor. They killed him, he roared, his voice echoing off the tile. They murdered my brother. Where is he? Where's the doctor who murdered my brother? His eyes were the color of a storm that had learned how to scream. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Nurses scattered like startled birds, pressing themselves against walls and ducking into supply closets. A surgical tech abandoned a medication cart, its contents spilling across the floor with the sound of a small avalanche. Alarms began their urgent wailing throughout the surgical wing, overhead paging, monitors, the automated alert system triggered by panic buttons. A resident bolted toward the back stairs. Another vanished into an adjacent operating room and locked the door behind her. The hospital security protocol activated with the hollow urgency of a system built for someone who'd never actually needed it. Everyone moved away. Everyone ran. Sarah moved toward him. She stepped out of the observation gallery and into the corridor with her hands clearly visible, palms open, arms at shoulder height in the universal language of non-threat. Her breathing was measured, controlled, the same breathing she'd used outside a schoolhouse in Tikrit when a man with an AK-47 had barricaded himself with 3 children inside. Her voice, when it came, was steady and low, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. No alarm in her tone. No fear. Just a measured, human voice cutting through the chaos. "My name is Sarah," she said to the massive man. "What's your name?" The wrench paused mid-swing. He turned toward her, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed carved from stone. His grief was so raw it seemed to vibrate in the air around him. "Stay back," he snarled, raising the wrench. "I'm not moving," Sarah said. She stood perfectly still, hands still visible. Her eyes met his directly, not challenging, not submissive, just honest. "I need to know your name." "Please?" The question seemed to catch him off balance. Most people were running. This one was standing 5 feet away, asking his name as if they were meeting for coffee. His breathing was ragged, his shoulders heaving. "James," he said finally, his voice cracking. "My brother, David, he came here for a simple surgery. They said it was routine. And now he's dead because of these butchers." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But she didn't look away. "What kind of surgery was David having?" she asked, still in that same measured voice. "Heart surgery," James spat. "They opened him up and said something went wrong. They said it was too late. And the surgeon, Sterling, they called him, he just abandoned David. Left him on the table like he was garbage. James's grip on the wrench tightened. He should be in prison. They all should. Through the observation window of OR03, Sarah caught movement. Sterling, his gown still on, his hand still wet from David Reeves' open chest cavity, was backing away from the operating table with the jerky panic of a man whose authority had suddenly evaporated. His resident, a third-year named Chen, no relation, was desperately trying to manage the monitors while simultaneously attempting to maintain the surgical field alone. The patient's blood pressure was dropping. The numbers were falling with the relentless momentum of a stone cast into deep water. Sarah could read the monitors from 30 feet away. 60 systolic. Falling. Her eyes flicked back to James, then toward the supply closet where Sterling had disappeared moments earlier, moving with the urgency of a man running from accountability. "Listen to me very carefully," Sarah said to James. Her voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. "Your brother David, when his heart stopped, did they tell you what happened? Did they mention fluid?" James stared at her, confusion flickering across his devastated face. "They said, cardiac tamponade. They said fluid around his heart was compressing it, and by the time they realized it, it was too late. Too late to help him." Sarah's jaw clenched. "Recognition. That's a treatable condition," she said. "If someone catches it fast enough, they can evacuate that fluid and save the patient. Right now, in that operating room," she pointed toward OR3 without looking away from James, "another patient is developing the exact same presentation. The same condition that killed your brother. And the man who should be performing the procedure that might save that patient's life just abandoned him." "What?" James's wrench lowered slightly, confusion replacing rage. "In that room," Sarah said, "someone else's brother is dying right now from the same thing that took David. And the surgeon who should be handling this emergency chose to hide instead of fight. Your brother deserved better than that cowardice. So does this patient." Through the window, Sarah could see Chen's face, the terrible, helpless fear of a resident holding an open chest cavity and watching a patient slip toward death. The monitor's rhythm was becoming irregular. O2 sat dropping. The ventilator hissed, but oxygen alone couldn't fix what was happening inside David Reeves' successor in the operating theater. "I can help that patient," Sarah said to James. "But I need you to let me go into that room. And I'm asking you to help me. Will you hold the door open so I can save him? So no one else has to feel what you're feeling right now." James stared at her for 3 full seconds. His massive chest heaved. Tears streamed down his face, carving paths through days of stubble and despair. His hand, still gripping the wrench, began to shake, not from fear, but from the terrible exhaustion of grief finally finding somewhere to go besides rage. He nodded once, jerking his chin toward OR3. "Help him," he said. "Please." Sarah moved toward the operating room with the precise, fluid grace of someone who had navigated worse terrain than hospital corridors. James followed, his wrench now hanging at his side like a weight he could no longer carry. When they reached the OR doors, Sarah pushed through without breaking stride. Inside OR3, the third-year resident Chen looked up with the expression of someone watching their career collapse in real time. The patient's monitors were screaming. Alarms that should have prompted Sterling's intervention were instead announcing his absence. The open surgical field was dry, exposed, a human heart working against the compression of fluid building in the pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding it slowly, methodically strangling the organ within. Sarah's entire demeanor shifted in the space between heartbeats. The measured, grieving brother whisperer vanished. In her place stood someone else entirely. Her hands moved with the absolute certainty of muscle memory, 17 years of field medicine, 3 tours where she'd performed emergency procedures under fire, where hesitation meant death. She called out for equipment with the clipped authority of someone accustomed to obedience. 14-gauge needle. Pericardiocentesis kit. Push 1 mg epi, stat. The nursing staff, startled by her sudden command presence, moved to comply without hesitation. Someone, a tech who'd seen enough crisis to know authority when it materialized, gathered the equipment. Sarah was already positioning herself at the patient's left side, her hand steady as surgical lasers. She spoke to James without looking at him, her voice a continuous stream of explanation and purpose. "Your brother David had the same thing happening to his heart that this patient has right now," she said, prepping the needle insertion point below the xiphoid process. "The fluid around the heart compresses it, restricts blood flow. It's called cardiac tamponade. The treatment is to evacuate that fluid, drain it away so the heart can do its job again. I'm going to do that now. I'm going to save this man's life the way someone should have saved your brother's." The needle moved with absolute precision. Below the xiphoid process, the needle angled toward the pericardial sac at exactly 45 degrees. Sarah's breathing never changed. Her hands never trembled. She was doing this in front of a man carrying a pipe wrench, in an operating room that had just been invaded, with security officers approaching, footsteps echoing down the corridor, and her hands might as well have been carved from marble. The needle found the pericardial membrane. Sarah felt the give, the slight resistance, the moment when the needle passed through tissue and entered the fluid-filled space. She attached the syringe. Pulled back. The syringe filled with blood, accumulated fluid that had been slowly crushing the heart beneath it. The amount was significant. Dangerous. Precisely the amount that would have killed David Reeves had anyone known to look for it. "Blood's evacuating," Sarah said, her voice clinical and certain. "Cardiac output should normalize once we remove the compressive force." She pulled back, methodical and unhurried. Each milliliter represented a fraction more cardiac function, a fraction of blood pressure climbing back toward survivable numbers. The monitors began their gradual migration from code blue chaos toward recognizable rhythm. O2 sat climbing. Pressure rising. The patient's vitals beginning their return from the edge of the abyss. Security officers appeared in the doorway but halted, taking in the scene. A woman in surgical attire performing an emergency life-saving procedure with the precision of someone who'd trained for exactly this moment. A massive grieving man standing silent, his wrench lowered, watching someone do for another family what tragedy had prevented someone doing for his own. The security team exchanged glances and held position, understanding without words that interrupting this scene would be a mistake. In the supply closet down the corridor, Dr. Sterling waited in darkness, his breathing shallow and panicked, entirely unaware that the woman he'd publicly humiliated in the cafeteria, the woman he'd wagered a month's salary would quit, was currently saving a patient he'd abandoned to die. Entirely unaware that heroism had just walked directly into the chaos he'd created and dismantled it with nothing but steady hands and a measured voice. And entirely unaware that everything he'd carefully constructed was about to collapse. The monitor alarm from OR3 pierced through the standoff like a gunshot. Flat, mechanical, relentless. The surgical resident's voice crackled through the intercom, panicked, raw, "I need help. I need help now. BP's dropping. 65 systolic and falling." Sarah's entire body went still. The grieving brother with the pipe wrench didn't notice. His eyes were locked on her, breathing ragged, muscles trembling with the weight of his rage. But Sarah's mind had already shifted coordinates. She recognized the vital signs. They told a story she'd read 1,000 times on stretchers in Tikrit, in field surgical tents, in the moments before blood pressure became a line on a monitor instead of a life. Cardiac tamponade. Blood compressing the heart. The patient couldn't pump. The pressure built. The rhythm would follow in seconds. She kept her hands visible. Her voice steady as granite. "That patient needs you to let me go. Right now." Not a request. A statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that made the brother's breathing change, just slightly. "Your brother. The one you lost. I'm going to save someone else's brother. But I need 10 seconds. The pipe wrench wavered. Sarah didn't wait for permission. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had been forged in environments where hesitation meant body bags. No one moved to stop her. The remaining residents were frozen, arms crossed, protecting themselves. Hospital security stood at the far end of the corridor, unwilling to advance on the man with the weapon. She ran. OR3's doors slid open like a mouth gasping. The patient on the table was the man from Tikrit, the one who carried her name on his forearm in permanent ink, though the brain injury that came later had stolen her face from his memory. His surgical site was open. Dr. Sterling was nowhere. The resident, a young woman named Chen, no relation, though the coincidence felt like the universe's dark sense of humor, was calling for backup that wouldn't arrive in time. 50 seconds. That's what the monitor gave her. 50 seconds before the heart stopped. Sarah's hands moved before her brain finished calculating the geometry. She didn't think about protocol. Didn't think about authorization. Didn't think about anything except the singular clarity of a life in her hands and the knowledge that she'd done this before, in a schoolhouse outside Tikrit with nothing but a field surgical kit and the roar of helicopter rotors overhead. 14-gauge angiocath, she said. Her voice belonged to someone else, someone older, colder, forged in places Houston couldn't imagine. Midclavicular line. Second intercostal space. The resident handed her the needle with shaking hands. The antiseptic smell, sharp, acidic, almost comforting, filled her nostrils as she swabbed the patient's chest. The needle went in. No hesitation. No tremor. Hand steady as a surgical laser. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. Life returning. 0.5 liters of blood, Sarah said quietly, watching the syringe fill with the dark fluid that had been suffocating the patient's heart. Her voice was conversational, almost casual, as if she weren't performing an emergency intervention that would take a trauma surgeon 40 minutes under normal circumstances. Maybe 0.7. The monitor began its resurrection, one blip at a time. Sinus rhythm finding its way back from the void. Behind her, the grieving brother stood in the doorway. The pipe wrench had lowered to his side. His eyes were locked on Sarah's face, watching her hands, watching the monitor climb. 85 oxygen saturation. Then 90. Then 94. She did it, the brother whispered. She saved him. Sarah stripped off her gloves without turning. Her movements were precise, economical, each gesture stripped of excess, military clean. Only then did she turn to face the man who'd come here with violence and left with mercy. Security entered through the second door, 2 officers with hands ready but voices gentle. They'd seen what happened. Everyone had. The brother set the pipe wrench on the floor. His legs buckled slightly. One of the officers caught him, and he didn't resist. As they led him away, he looked back at Sarah, really looked at her, and said something that made his voice crack. Thank you. For saving my brother. Thank you. The door closed. The surgical resident stared at Sarah as if she'd just materialized from another dimension. How did you? I mean, where did you? The words dissolved into nothing. There were no words in the resident's vocabulary that applied to what she'd just witnessed. The patient's chest rose and fell. The monitor showed a steady rhythm. A life that had been seconds away from stopping was now, impossibly, continuing. Sarah began washing her hands at the sink without a word. The water was ice cold. She watched the antiseptic swirl down the drain, watching it mix and disappear. And then the supply closet door opened. Dr. Sterling stepped out into OR3 like a man emerging from a cave into daylight. His face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, relief, then calculation. The calculation was worst. It was the look of a man watching his entire world shift on its axis and beginning to understand the magnitude of the threat standing in front of him. He'd seen everything. Every intervention. Every impossible maneuver. Every moment that proved Sarah Chen was not the timid nurse who'd accepted a lunch tray being knocked to the floor. He'd seen someone pull a patient back from death using nothing but precision and muscle memory. He'd seen a ghost. What the hell did you just do? His voice came out tight, controlled, the dangerous kind of control that precedes explosions. You are not authorized for that procedure. You violated every protocol in this hospital. You engaged with an armed assailant. You performed major surgical intervention without physician supervision. Sarah turned to face him. She dried her hands on a paper towel with methodical care. When she spoke, her voice was level as a heartbeat monitor showing perfect rhythm. That patient would be dead. That's not the point. Sterling's face was flushing now, his voice climbing. The point is you've created a massive liability. You've endangered this hospital. I've done my job, Sarah said quietly. She dropped the paper towel into the waste bin. Something you forgot about an hour ago. Sterling's eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth to respond, but something in her bearing, something in the way she stood with her weight balanced and her jaw set, made him stop. He'd seen combatants move like that before. He'd read about them in the newspaper. He swallowed. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted. It was no longer the tone of a man accustomed to control. It was the tone of someone beginning to sense that the ground beneath his feet had become unstable. "You'll be hearing from HR," he said quietly. "Pack your things." He left the operating room without looking back. The surgical resident continued staring at Sarah as the monitors beat their steady, beautiful song of life continuing exactly as it should. "What just happened?" the resident whispered. Sarah didn't answer. She was already thinking 2 steps ahead, toward the suspension notice she knew would be waiting, toward the board members Sterling would call, toward the employment references that no longer existed. She was thinking about her daughter waiting at home, about the identity she'd built so carefully now cracking at its foundation. But not now. Not yet. Now, she simply existed in the space between heartbeats, watching a man she'd saved in Tikrit continue breathing, continue living, continue existing in a world that didn't know how close it had come to losing him. The monitor beeped. 96 oxygen saturation. Steady. Holding. She was going to lose everything. She could feel it in the air, that particular pressure drop that came before the storm. But for the next few seconds, standing in OR 3 at Mercy General in Houston, with a patient's heart beating steadily beneath the monitor's reassuring rhythm, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had done what she was built to do. She'd saved a life. Everything else could burn. She'd saved a life. Everything else could burn. Dr. Sterling emerged from the supply closet 17 minutes after security hauled the grieving man away. His face had already shifted, not the stunned expression of a witness, but the calculating mask of a predator repositioning for the kill. He walked straight to the administrative wing, his phone already out, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who'd spent 8 years insulating himself from consequences. The first call went to the hospital's chief of surgery at 3:42 in the afternoon. "Yes, Dr. Hartley, I'm calling about a serious protocol violation in OR 3. The trauma nurse, Sarah Chen, performed an unauthorized procedure without physician oversight during an active security threat." "Yes, exactly. She violated every standard of care. Unsupervised intervention in a life-or-death situation. We're talking about reckless endangerment disguised as heroics." Sterling's voice moved like honey through silk, reasonable, measured, concerned. "The patient did survive, but that's almost worse. It sets a precedent that nurses can ignore the chain of command when they think it's justified. I'm calling because I believe she needs immediate disciplinary review. I've already documented everything." He hung up before Hartley could ask the questions that might expose the lie. By 3:58, he'd called the hospital's malpractice insurance coordinator, the board's executive committee liaison, and a contact at the State Medical Review Board, all with the same narrative, each time slightly refined. By 4:15, he'd pivoted to something darker, calls to what he believed were Sarah's previous employers, numbers pulled from the sparse employment history that the hospital's hiring department had provided. Those calls found disconnected lines. Voicemails that never answered. Addresses that no longer corresponded to medical facilities. He took this as confirmation rather than red flag. Obviously she's hiding something, he told his alliance of 3 hospital board members who owed him favors from various surgical equipment kickbacks. Her background doesn't check out. The credentials are questionable. We'd be negligent not to investigate further. By 6:28 that evening, fabricated witness statements began appearing in Sarah's personnel file. A statement from an unnamed resident claiming Sarah had acted recklessly and without authorization. Another from a surgical tech asserting she'd clearly exceeded her scope of practice. Sterling's signature appeared on each one as the reporting physician, lending them the weight of medical authority that junior staff wouldn't dream of challenging. At 7:04 in the evening, Sarah received the termination notice. Suspension pending investigation. Effective immediately. She was not to return to the unit, not to contact patients, not to retrieve personal belongings without a witness present. The email was signed by Dr. Hartley but bore Sterling's fingerprints in every accusatory line. Sarah sat at the kitchen table of the small house she rented in the Heights, the suspension letter printed and placed carefully in front of her, each word a calculated blow that had landed with surgical precision. Not from her hands. From his. The fluorescent kitchen light above cast everything in a sterile glow, and for the first time in 8 years, since the moment she'd stepped off the plane at Dover, officially erased from military records, she felt the weight of that erasure collapse inward. The combat boots sat in the closet at Mercy General. She'd left them this morning like she always did, hidden beneath her spare scrubs in the locker room at the end of shift change. That's what happened when you try to live 2 lives. Eventually one of them devoured the other. At 7:52, Maya came home from her after-school program. 8 years old, still small enough to fit under Sarah's arm, still young enough to notice when her mother's face looked wrong. Sarah had been sitting in the dark for 20 minutes, the laptop screen dark, the letter still on the table. "Mommy." Maya's voice came small and careful, the way children speak when they sense the adults are broken. "Why are you home early?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, her jaw tightening against the urge to let the tears come in front of her. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen did not cry at kitchen tables. She did not let fear win. She did not collapse. But she was a mother first. "Work got complicated, baby," Sarah said quietly. "Are you sad?" Maya climbed into her lap with the unburdened certainty of a child. "No." Sarah's voice came steady, even as her eyes burned. "I'm not sad. I'm just thinking." She held her daughter and said nothing more, because the truth was too heavy, that the man she'd saved in OR3 was going to wake up with a second chance at life, and she wasn't going to be there to see it. That the only identity she'd been able to construct here, the quiet nurse, the dedicated caregiver, the woman who showed up, was being systematically dismantled by a surgeon who'd spent 5 minutes trying to bury the evidence of his own crimes. That everything she'd built to hide who she was had made her visible in exactly the ways that mattered. 2 days stretched like weeks. 48 hours of suspension during which Sterling's network tightened. The board members he'd called released statements supporting the investigation. The malpractice insurance coordinator began building a file. Sterling himself continued his work methodically, calling the disconnected numbers again, assuming they'd somehow reconnected, growing more frustrated when they hadn't. He began taking screenshots of the failed calls, adding them to his documentation, evidence of Sarah's clearly falsified employment history, proof that she'd lied about her credentials to infiltrate the hospital. What Sterling didn't know was that those disconnected numbers belonged to something called JSOC Personnel Records Management. That the addresses those calls pinged off belonged to a classified DOD facility in Alexandria, Virginia. That every attempt to access those non-existent employment records triggered an automated security protocol. That somewhere in a federal building downtown, a computer logged the timestamp, the phone number, the caller identification, and the nature of the inquiry with bureaucratic precision. The parallel investigation started at 9:43 a.m. on the second day of Sarah's suspension. At 11:18 that morning, a Black Hawk helicopter banked hard over the Houston skyline, its rotors cutting the air into violent pieces, the sound rolling across downtown like distant thunder. Emergency services had called ahead, the aircraft needed landing clearance, and Mercy General's roof helipad sat empty and waiting. Sarah was home when it landed. She didn't know yet. She was sitting on the porch of her small house, watching Maya's school bag and trying to figure out what she was going to tell her daughter when the suspension became permanent. When the accusation stuck. When there was nothing left but the boots and the memory of who she'd been. At the hospital, the security desk received a call that changed everything. Federal agents. SEAL Team 3 from Naval Station Corpus Christi, 3 hours south. They were en route. They needed to speak with Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. And they needed hospital administration to stop asking questions and start providing answers. The Black Hawk touched down with a violence that shattered several windows in the orthopedic wing. 8 SEALs in tactical gear descended with the mechanical precision of men who'd trained together for years, their presence transforming the rooftop into a military staging area. 2 FBI agents followed, one carrying a folder marked with federal seals that made hospital security stand down without argument. Dr. Hartley stood in the lobby and watched the tactical team move through his hospital like they owned it. He didn't. Nobody did when the federal government came calling. The moment the SEAL team's boots hit the ground floor, Sterling appeared in the administrative wing, his face already forming excuses. "I'm certain there's been some mistake," he said, his voice carrying the old authority. "There is no Senior Chief Chen employed here. We have a Sarah Chen who was recently suspended for protocol violations, but where is she?" The SEAL team leader's voice came flat and final, the tone of a man unaccustomed to repetition. "I don't know where she is. She's been suspended pending." One of the FBI agents opened his phone and made a call. 20 seconds later, a family was receiving an unannounced visit at home. A small 8-year-old girl was answering the door before her mother could move, and a uniformed Navy officer was kneeling to her eye level with the kind gentleness reserved for children of warriors. "Is your mom here?" he asked. Maya looked up at her mother, who had appeared in the doorway, her face pale, and spoke with the clarity of a child who doesn't yet understand the weight of what she's saying. "My mom's a Senior Chief Petty Officer," she said simply. Sarah's hand found Maya's shoulder. Everything stopped. Everything changed. The SEAL team leader and the FBI agents arrived at the house 17 minutes later. One of them was carrying the military file. The other carried handcuffs. Back at Mercy General, in the administrative lobby, a junior nurse named Kim, the same nurse who'd watched Sterling humiliate Sarah in the cafeteria, stood frozen as one of the FBI agents pulled out a document and began reading aloud. Her voice trembled as she spoke, the words hitting like artillery in the silence. 2 silver stars. The agent paused, letting the weight of each medal settle. 3 bronze stars with Valor. Another pause. Every staff member in the lobby had stopped moving. Purple Heart. And a Navy Cross. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of respect that couldn't be faked, the respect of one warrior for another who'd walked through fire and emerged carrying other people out. He named each decoration. He named the operations that had earned them. He named Sarah Chen as the operator who'd led the extraction of 12 hostages from a compound in Tikrit while under direct fire, who'd brought home personnel that everyone had written off as lost. Dr. Sterling's face drained of all color. His mouth opened. No words came out. The second FBI agent turned directly to him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Dr. Marcus Sterling, when you attempted to verify Ms. Chen's employment history 3 days ago, you called several disconnected numbers." The agent consulted his folder. "When those calls failed, you fabricated witness statements. You falsified documentation to justify her termination. Is that correct?" Sterling tried to speak. Failed. Tried again. "I was protecting those disconnected numbers," the agent continued, his voice moving like a scalpel, "triggered an automatic Department of Defense security alert, which triggered our investigation into your activities over the last 8 years, which revealed systematic healthcare fraud, inflated medical supply billing, kickback arrangements with equipment vendors, and insurance fraud totaling $2.3 million. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. 2.3 million. Sterling's hands began to shake visibly. "You don't understand. I was." Senior Chief Chen's meticulous charting flagged the first discrepancy 18 months ago, the agent said. "Her presence threatened your entire operation. So you created pretexts for termination before she could notice the full scope. You attempted to dismantle her credibility by accessing classified employment records, which triggered federal protocols. Which brought us here. Which ended this. The agent nodded to his partner. The second FBI agent stepped forward with handcuffs that caught the lobby lights like surgical steel. Dr. Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest for wire fraud, healthcare fraud, and falsification of federal documents related to an attempt to obstruct investigation into fraud scheme. The agent recited rights while cuffing Sterling's wrists. Anything you say can and will be used against you. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the lobby like a period at the end of a sentence. Sterling's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, finding none. The board members who'd stood with him minutes earlier had already stepped away, distancing themselves from the wreckage. The hospital CEO had materialized with security, his voice cold as he addressed Sterling directly. You're terminated effective immediately. Surrender your badge and all hospital access. Sterling was led out through the main lobby while staff watched, residents who'd laughed when he'd humiliated Sarah, nurses who'd turned blind eyes to his cruelty, all of them watching him walked past the very people he'd terrorized. The lobby doors opened to the brilliant Houston afternoon, and news vans were already arriving, their satellites rising like mechanical flowers. Sarah wasn't there to see it. She was standing on her front porch with Maya's hand in hers, watching the FBI agents nod at her with a respect that finally recognized who she actually was. Not just a nurse. Not just a woman hiding in scrubs. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. 2 years later, dawn broke over Houston in shades of gold and crimson. On the rooftop helipad of Mercy General, Sarah stood in her dress naval uniform, every medal positioned precisely, every ribbon in its proper place. The worn combat boots that had stayed hidden in her locker for 8 years sat polished to mirror shine beside the helipad marker, no longer a secret, no longer something to be ashamed of. Maya, now 10 years old, held them carefully, understanding finally what they meant. The hospital board had reinstated Sarah within 24 hours of Sterling's arrest. She'd been offered the position of Director of Emergency Services 6 months later after her protocols revolutionized their crisis management. The pericardiocentesis technique she'd performed under pressure became part of the hospital's standard training. The patient in OR3, Michael Torres, whose memory had slowly been returning through months of therapy, now worked as a peer counselor for traumatic brain injury survivors. He'd remembered her face 3 months ago, had broken down in her office, thanking the woman who'd saved his life twice. Staff gathered below the helipad as the sun climbed higher. Kim, now Sarah's deputy director, stood with tears streaming down her face. The junior nurse who'd watched the humiliation, who'd made the choice to look away, who'd finally made the choice to look forward. Far across Houston, Marcus Sterling pulled into the parking lot of Houston Community College. He carried a battered CPR dummy and a paycheck for $240, earned teaching basic life support to students who didn't know he'd once been a surgeon. His medical license was permanently revoked. His name appeared in ethical case studies as a cautionary tale. The federal fraud conviction ensured he would never practice medicine again, never hold power over anyone, never have the chance to corrode another institution from within. On the helipad, Sarah lifted those worn boots one final time, then set them carefully in a shadow box beside a plaque, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, Courage Under Fire, Compassion Under Pressure. Maya hugged her mother as the first helicopter of the morning approached for landing, an emergency arrival that would begin Sarah's new watch. The rotors cut the air into pieces, the sound rolling across the hospital like a declaration. She stood in full light now, no longer hiding. Sarah's voice came quiet but absolute as she looked out over the city awakening beneath her. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. The camera pulled back to show the full hospital, the city waking, a woman who finally stood in full light after years in shadow, and everyone watching understood that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. If you're watching this, you already know someone like Sarah, someone whose strength goes unrecognized because it wears scrubs instead of medals. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to hide who you really are, share your story in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the quiet warriors among us, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the most powerful transformations happen when people finally see you for who you actually are.